Hello, good morning still, and welcome back, everyone, to our Good Conference 2023. My name is Keith McDonald. I am your host MC for the day, as well as moderator of the Data Equity panel. So I'm going to introduce our panel right away, and they'll flick on their cameras as I mention their names, and then we'll start our conversation. It's a heavy-duty topic, no doubt. So first up, we have Phan, who's the Manager of Research, Anti-Racism Policy Unit, RCMP. She's also a member of the Good Board of Directors and has done some work here in the city of Toronto as well. And her expertise is very valued to us in Good. So if you want to flick on your camera, join us. Hello. And then we have Jutta Treviranus. I hope I've said it right, even after that rehearsal. And you're director and professor, Inclusive Design Research Center, OCAD University, which is a very well-respected institution. My wife actually is an alumnus. And also we have Blair Attard-Frost, who is a PhD candidate, Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, also a well-respected faculty. So if you'd like to join us, Blair, there we go. So here we are, folks. We've got a good bit of time to discuss this, and we're hoping that viewers will perhaps propose some thoughts and ask some questions. Feel free to do that as we go, because we've left this deliberately as a bit of a free-for-all. We're hoping we have a very good dynamic discussion. And first question I'd like to throw out at you to get things started is, let's just define data equity a little bit. We know there is perhaps some confusion. Equity may be obvious to some people, but not so to others. And Jutta, you had a very interesting point just before we went live as to the word equity and how it stands in Canada as a thing, an official thing. So maybe you'd want to start and then others weigh in.
Yeah, we were surprised to find that equity is actually not legally defined within Canada in the way that it is assumed to, or the meaning that it's assumed to have within the field. And there is, of course, this distinction between equity and equality, where equality is simply equal treatment of everyone as opposed to equal outcomes. So equity refers more to fairness, justice, freedom from discrimination, and the types of actions that you need to take such that there's not just equal treatment, but equal outcomes. And I'd welcome further definitions from the other speakers.
Feel free to jump in, folks.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here because, all the things that Jutta was pointing out in terms of, our use of equity in its institutions and in our policies, it really speaks to process, right? It's like, how do we support people through the process, and how do we look at our systems so that we get people to arrive at similar outcomes, and recognizing that people start from different places, and so it speaks to really more to structures and processes to support people as opposed to a thing, and which suggests that equity as an idea, and as an outcome, we may never reach it, right? Like, it's one of those things we aspire to, but it's all in the journey and how we get there.
Yeah, I think those are great points. And I think also, when I think of equity, I think of, a combination of both fairness and justice on the one hand. So fairness being something that's, a little bit forward looking and thinking about how do we ensure that some groups are, treated well and others are not mistreated, whereas justice is more kind of restorative, and thinking about this notion of process again, if a process went badly for some reason or another, created some kind of unjust outcome in the past, going forward, how do we correct that? So both a dual focus on fairness and justice, as well as on process and outcome, right? Trying to, achieve this ideal outcome, but knowing that doesn't always happen. And sometimes there's a need to kind of go back and correct things through new processes.
And I like Maya's, discussion of not being able to complete it, because it isn't something that you can certify where you can sort of check, now this is equitable. It's an ongoing process. It's something that you need to be vigilant to all the time. So there's an industry springing up that is sort of giving certifications regarding AI ethics. And that is somewhat misleading because, of course, equity is not something that you can say, okay, it's complete. We're done now.
And also, I think the idea of how do we know when we get there? I think it was Kathleen Wynne that talked about, oh, that's a stretch goal. Remember that term, which I thought from a PR standpoint was very interesting. But yeah, I think we talked about in the advertisement, excuse me, for this session about bridging the open divide, of course, but it's imperative that data equity become paramount, first principle, and the idea of non-biased. And yesterday at the workshops, I personally discussed some issues around bias, how difficult that is to achieve. I think first thing is recognizing that there is bias, acknowledging that, and then doing your absolute best to prevent that from happening. I wonder what your take is around equity and bias as an impediment to it. How do we crack this bias problem?
Can I, this is something that I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I've actually moved away from the use of the term bias because, of course, bias is there. There's no way to remove bias. Everything is somewhat biased. So we've started to use the term statistical discrimination as the thing that we're quite worried about, which doesn't encompass all of the things that have been currently thought of bias. I mean, usually when there's a discussion of AI bias, it's about a data gap and lack of representation within the data set or human discrimination entering into the process. But statistical discrimination is something that has not been covered and is frequently ignored in many of the AI equity discussions. And it's a real and increasing harm in AI decision systems. And what do I mean by that? AI uses statistical reasoning, which means that it's using statistics to optimize the choices that are being made to identify unknowns or anomalies, etc. And it's getting better and better at discriminating against things that don't match a particular pattern or that don't get towards the optima. And so if you're an outlier or a small minority in a data set, then even if you're fully even if you have full representation there, then all of the decisions are going to be against you. So it goes, so whether it's to suggest, I think with Mai's area, that you are a potential harm or that you are flagged as a security risk, or the way that you're treated by a health calculator that determines what your treatment is, whether you get to keep your children because you're identified as an unfit parent. I mean, there's so many massive implications of this that go well beyond all the chatter and the dystopia, the potential dystopia. This is a real risk, right? So I've moved away from bias because it becomes this complicated argument about what is actually bias and the fact that the systems are biased. All systems are biased and there's no way to remove the bias. But it also gets at a fundamental issue in that we use statistics to reason. And what are the implications of using statistics to reason? What if you are statistically insignificant? What if you are a statistical outlier? Even our systems pre-AI were biased against you. And so it compels us to use this moment in AI to think about, wait a sec, where have we been going? Because AI is simply accelerating, automating, and amplifying what we've done in the past. And it throws a mirror at our processes.
And perhaps legitimize bias, right? We do have a question right away. Let's keep this interactive. If the audience wants to weigh in, we have a question or a comment from Jonathan, and it's what about predictive analytical reasoning that is an even more ambiguous form of bias than statistical bias?
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that because, that is a tool that, has been used in policing, right? And how do we predict whether somebody is high risk of re-offending, in corrections? How do we predict who's going, where the next crime is going to occur, right? And so that kind of, and that is an example of what Jutta is talking about.
Exactly.
The use of statistical tools to optimize, in this case, prediction of crime and certain behaviors for the attention of the authorities. And so, that's where it's not ambiguous at all. It's very clear that the bias is embedded and encoded. Because one of the things, and I wanted to jump in and kind of amplify what Jutta was saying in regards to, we have to rethink data itself and appreciate that data is not just an output, that we produce as a result of how we do things, how our systems are set up, how our systems capture certain things and miss other things, right? Fail to capture other things. What doesn't get measured doesn't get counted, for example. But data is also a process and a relationship, right? Data is also systems and structures. And when we don't look at data in all of those various dimensions and ways, we fail to appreciate just how much data is very much like a language with its own logic and syntax, and how we use that language has a real impact on, on how we shape our world, right? And AI is giving us the tools that are increasingly more powerful, increasingly expansive in its scope and reach, in a way that as a society we have not matured as fast. We haven't matured in our laws, in our policies, in our relationships to each other. And so we're letting loose these tools without fully understanding even the fundamental components and basis of it, which is data. In the work that I do, trying to change data practices in policing, but not just that. Also, there's a huge component of changing the culture around data in policing, from using data that's outwardly facing to make policing, to grease the wheels of policing, to using data for transparency and accountability, and for understanding the impacts of policing, so that we can address all the issues of, whether we are providing equitable treatment, and equitable treatment, again, recognizing that it is vague and it needs to be defined with communities at the table, right? And so that's all part of changing the culture of how we relate to communities as policing organizations. And so it goes way more beyond the technical. And sometimes I find the conversation too narrowly focused on the technical aspects of data and data systems and tools.
I think it's a very, very good point. And I'd like to focus on that in the next question. Blair, I'm going to address this to you. You mentioned maturity, and I like the word maturity and mature, right? And so whether our laws are mature is one thing, but whether we as humans are mature. I think a lot of times we talk about lifelong learning and so on. And I know as a aging white guy, I've learned a lot of things. In particular, Maya, I want to recognize you from your contribution to Go Open Data. A lot of things really help better inform my thinking, my position on things, recognition of perhaps oversight, whatever. I mean, I think that's very significant. Not everyone buys into that, though. So Blair, I want to start with you. Just wondering, what's your take on the idea of maturity, and are we even close to having more collective society understanding of equity, or is it still a huge climb?
That's a really interesting question. I think maybe a way to kind of address it is, I really want to kind of build on what Maya was saying about this notion of, the relationships surrounding data, and this notion of kind of data as like a broader social or organizational practice. And I think what's really kind of important to note, I approach a lot of my thinking on AI from a supply chains or value chains perspective, right? And I think it's so important to note in a lot of these conversations around, AI ethics and AI that we're seeing, that we really need to kind of reassert social and material reality. There's this tendency to, treat data as this kind of abstraction and focus a lot on, these issues of kind of bias in the very, statistical or non-material sense. But these questions of bias are fundamentally, questions of power. And these types of power relationships, these are, going back to equity and process, these processes through which particular relationships have become just or unjust over time, these have emerged from underlying material realities and social structures that are long-standing, right? So if we want to think about data equity, we kind of need to think a bit upstream about where a lot of these problems, and I'll tie this back into maturity in a second too, because that's a great question too. But I think if we want to kind of reach a point in, I guess, social or organizational maturity, if that's a way to think of it, where we're able to kind of tackle equity appropriately, we really need to kind of consider what's upstream from the data, right? So who's involved in data practices, who's actually working with these data sets and building them. If we have a machine learning pipeline that's set up, that's being trained on this data, right? Who's involved in designing that? Further downstream, what's the AI system that's built on that ML model going to do? What kinds of applications is it going to be used for? We might even think even further upstream into education, right? Before even hiring people to work on an AI team, right? Like, what's the composition of our STEM education programs, computer science, data science education programs, our equity-seeking groups, marginalized communities being, represented in education as that goes through into the workforce and then into data practices and the systems, outcomes of the systems. So I think if we want to kind of reach a point where, we think in a more holistic sense about this notion of like social maturity, are we even at the point structurally where as a society we're ready to kind of tackle these equity problems in any meaningful way? We really need to take every chance we can to reassert social and material reality in these conversations, because it is very important, of course, to deal with these data issues of statistics, but all of those ultimately, revolve around different forms of organizational and social practice and pre-existing social structures that form these feedback loops with our data practices.
And I think too, I like the word agency, right? I think sometimes we forget that everyone does have agency. There's skin in the game, right? So our feelings, our thinking may be different, but that's where the dialogue is so important, right? Because if we can communicate and suddenly bring more realization to these issues, it would be helpful. But yeah, everyone should have some agency in the conversation. And sometimes I think that's forgotten as well, right? It's articulated, but there's no deeper discussion beyond what you mean by saying this is what should happen. We do have a question, by the way, and it's very, very diplomatically put. And I know it's from Denis Carr. Hello, Denis. Thank you for attending today. I love how you presented this. When convenient in the conversation, I think we might as well get to it right now. It would be helpful to hear the panel's thoughts around the balance between seeking greater equity, representation in the data we release versus ensuring rights to privacy are maintained. For instance, we may currently need to aggregate up or categorize as other data points for an equity deserving group because the count number is low, and that may risk individual identification. The result from an analysis perspective is that equity deserving groups may not be seen in the data. So, that's a very interesting issue as well. I think, Jutta, you've got something to say already. Go ahead.
Yeah, quite a bit to say about this, because of course there's this data impasse dilemma for especially a group that I work with. Our community includes many people with disabilities, and there's been a lot of chatter about privacy and this right to privacy, etc. And there are privacy protections emerging. But the issue is that for people with disabilities who are highly unique, the primary data characteristic is difference and uniqueness, difference from the average, difference from what is the middle of the road in terms of the data. And if you are highly unique, then you can be re-identified. So the primary thing we hear about in terms of privacy is de-identification at source. Well, if you are unique, you can be re-identified. The other aspect is of data protection is differential privacy. So you remove the aspects that would identify you from the data system, but by removing those, you also remove the information that's needed for the AI to actually serve you. And then lastly, people with disabilities are usually bartering their privacy for essential services. If it's a choice between something that you need to stay alive versus keeping your data private. But the other coin, or the other half of the flip side of the coin, is that people with disabilities are also some of the most vulnerable to data abuse and misuse. So the way to address underrepresentation within data sets, which seems to be one of the primary things get represented within data is the call of quite a number of equity groups. The problem is that the only strategy at the moment is to replicate, to increase the repeats of a particular data set that comes from a protected identity group. But the issue there is you are thereby denying the diversity. You are saying that there is homogeneity within a very, very diverse group. So it actually misleads the system and therefore biases the decision towards this idea of homogeneity as opposed to diversity. So it's a much far more difficult issue. And I think it requires, as Blair's mentioned, sort of going way back upstream and thinking about what are the assumptions that we've built not just into AI, but into the justification for AI and how we make decisions and how we're mechanizing this. I mean, to some extent, I don't think it's hyperbole to say that the way that we're doing it right now, we have created this slow and inexorable, pervasive, diffuse, mechanized eugenics in a sense, because we are eliminating and discriminating more and more against diversity. So that's, and just as a clarification regarding the previous question, it was statistical discrimination that I was using, which of course is intended to encompass the predictive and probabilistic analytics that is used in this mechanization of decision systems.
Oh, go ahead.
I think, just jumping on to that too is, yes, it is very complex and a nuanced conversation about how to balance these interests. And one of the practices we could do better in terms of understanding, well, what are those compromises or negotiations can we have in those conversations with communities and groups who may want to weigh in on whether, rather than the organization making the decision that, oh, these numbers are too small, we're going to, do X, Y, Z with it, or exclude them or hide them in some way, but actually engage with those communities because it really depends on the nature of the data and the data set and the information that's in it that, perhaps communities may and small groups may have an interest in, treating it in a certain way or using it in a certain way. But engaging them in the conversation to really understand, and not make that, preemptive decision to exclude. And that's hard for organizations to do because we don't have those that lens or those processes to engage in that way and openly collaborating with folks or even having the relationship necessary for those conversations. And so I do recognize that that's a challenge to do, but that is something, again, we need to build that capacity and that competency to have real inclusive participatory data practices.
We have a project that I'll quickly inject here called the Baby Bliss Spot. Because we've been critiquing AI and how AI processes have been operating for quite some time, somebody asked me, well, how would you do it? If one of the things to note is that if you're at the extreme edge sort of the statistical data plot, you have, because the world isn't working for you very well in general, you have extreme opportunities, but you also have extreme risks. And so one of the projects we've created is a community-led project by individuals who are non-speaking, who rely upon symbol sets to communicate. And they are building up the data from the beginning and determining exactly what the decisions should be. So we are trying to raise this chatbot responsibly by the individuals who it is intended to benefit. And it's been quite it's been a wonderful experience. and a wonderful way to experiment. But I completely agree with I mean, the people that feel the greatest impact of these decisions should be the ones that determine how the decisions are made and what data is relevant, as opposed to the imposition of a decision upon these individuals or the exclusion of these individuals. Because if you're unrecognized by the system, such as medical calculators, which are determining how you will be treated, if you are not, if the system doesn't understand you, it will still be determined or determining what treatment you have, and it'll go wrong.
Not sure if you want to weigh in, Blair?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of jump off some of these, points around, inclusion, participation, and erasure, because a lot of it just kind of resonates with my knowledge of just like queer, trans, non-binary people, and best practices for collecting data from that group of folks, since there's a lot of similar challenges, right? A lot of kind of extreme statistical outliers, a lot of concerns around privacy, a lot of concerns around erasure, especially when data is getting aggregated. And there's a lot of different kind of guidelines and best practices that have come out for data collection and for using data from queer, trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming folks. But a lot of it's been developed through extensive, especially in the context of healthcare, consultation with those communities, and in some cases even being led by people who are parts of those communities. So in thinking about those issues, perhaps there's examples of guidelines, best practices that have been used in those kinds of situations that can be turned to as well.
I think too, it occurs to me as you're talking that there's immediately visible issues, someone in a wheelchair, for example, but then there's the more invisible, like let's say not able to hear, and you may jump to conclusions. I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I've been diagnosed with a hernia, and I'm not able to lift anything until this is resolved. And my wife, I take her to work, and she teaches, and she has this big workshop kit and a cart and so on. And so recently she's been carrying that down our stairwell to get to the parking garage by herself. And people are saying to me, "What's the matter with you? Why don't you help this lady?" And there's no perception that, well, maybe there's a health issue here and so on. And secondly, I think from an equity standpoint, my wife is perfectly capable of carrying that cart. And I think it demonstrates that there's so much minutiae in all these things that it can be immediately obvious. And also the idea, well, you immediately jump to opening a door for someone in a wheelchair where potentially that's not really desirable, right? And it's a touchy-feely kind of issue. And I think what the key, and I want to find out if you agree with this, is again, appreciation for the awareness of it. And is the best route to ask, or, not just weigh in at all? I mean, what's your stance on that? How do we engage with the diversity and be equitable about it? Because someone, again, may value being assisted. So what's the best route for us to take? And be you have an issue or not have an issue?
Yeah, ask. I think landed upon it. I mean, it should be the individual that determines not only whether they need help, what help they need, how to identify them, how they like to be identified, all of those things. I think agency was a term we used, you used earlier. And unfortunately, there are quite a few barriers to agency, and there are many assumptions that, as you just pointed out, that are being made about what people's needs, preferences, way of presenting themselves are.
Yeah, and I think one thing that gets lost in our rush to make systems more efficient and cost effective, and all of these things are really driven by the imperatives of let's face it, capitalism, right? And the political systems that we have in place that really value these things. That we lose the perspective that each one of us is unique. Whether we fall within the bell curve or in the tails, in different ways, we are, unique in different ways. And some of us are, more standard in other ways. other folks, but even those at the tails, can be in the bell curve in other ways, and so we miss that uniqueness of our experiences, our individuality, and that reflects in the social relationships too, where we may not be very good at asking people, right, good questions. Like we don't even know how to talk to each other anymore in many ways. Social interaction has become so awkward these days because everyone's so used to engaging on screen or online in ways, and we do that way more than we engage face to face, where we get body language and we get a feel for the person and their vibe, right? And so yeah, I think we need to get back to that, and get back to those practices as more normalized than they may be coming.
And Maya, I love the fact that you brought up capitalism, because it's sort of the economies of scale that
Yes.
drive us towards thinking only about mass production and the average and the largest customer base. But also, I mean, related to that is democracy and how we're defending democracy at the moment. We've reduced it. I think a large risk with AI is the reductionism that happens. And if we reduce it to one person, one vote, a majority rules, then the critical needs of the minority are going to be outweighed by the trivial needs of the majority, right? And if we think about decisions, they're usually, if we have an impasse with respect to a decision, it's majority rules. So there is a propensity within every one of our conventions and systems to ignore those individuals who are outlying and who are possibly most impacted by the decisions that we're making.
That leads me to think of the word special needs as well. I don't think that's a very good term, is it? And I'm thinking
All
of
have special needs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking of Florida recently, which seems to be going extremely wacko. The idea, I guess the most recent law was the idea of washrooms again for transgender. And I believe the law states your origin gender is what you have to obey. And a fellow was quoted who is transitioning or transitioned into a male, who was a female, has a full beard and so on. And he said, the meaning of this law, literally, I have to go in now to the women's washroom. I don't think that's what you meant. So that's the problem, isn't it, with the issue? You can't just say it's this way, because there is a real continuum, isn't there? And I think that alone needs to be recognized and accepted. And that therein is a challenge right there. What's your comments on that?
I mean, maybe I could use that as an opportunity to kind of maybe tie together some of these issues around, communication, efficiency, capitalism, democracy. I think there's a lot of kind of policy implications to kind of what we're saying here around, public consultation, participation of equity-seeking groups, historically marginalized groups in policy processes around data and AI. We really have a deficit in that in Canada right now, especially around the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act we see in Parliament right now, where there was not really any adequate consultation done before putting it into Parliament. It's kind of a blank check where they're saying they're going to, in future regulation standards, say that they're going to be consulting with these groups in the future. But there really is an onus if we want to, advance these issues of data equity, and I guess increasingly AI equity too. There really is an onus on decision makers to kind of proactively communicate with these groups who are going to be impacted by these laws or by standards, or if it's a business, by any kind of guidelines or rules that you're setting out about how you're going to use data or AI in any sort of organization, right? To really try to understand people's needs on the front end before kind of, developing rules around that, and to not just do kind of, tokenizing or performative kind of public participation, which many of these initiatives often become, many consultation initiatives, but to kind of actively and directly collaborate with these groups and designing them iteratively throughout the process, right? So it's not just kind of, a one-off, okay, what are your needs? Tell us what we need to do, and then we're going to go back and build a policy instrument around it, right? But to come back and draft and redraft it to make sure there's no one who's being excluded from the conversation, right? You know, as we start thinking more and more about AI policy and AI regulation and, you know, updating existing data policy like the CPPA, for example, I think there's a really good opportunity to advance data equity on the part of policymakers and decision makers, and to advance, you know, equity more broadly by engaging in more rigorous public participation practices.
You know, I think too, it made me think when you're talking in terms of when there is meetings to discuss these things with governments, they're often, you know, up at some kind of table, like there's a chair and whatever, and the group is maybe speaking this way to a group. And I know there's lots of studies and people who action these things when they do meetings, rather than being in front of the table, they actually, you know, sit around the table with people. And I think governments, and again, our viewers, many of you are from governments, you can start thinking about that. How do you engage and how do you include in the conversation? Are you going to set yourself up at the head of the table as if you've got the power and you're in charge? Or in fact, you're going to somehow be part of the circulation, whether you go into breakout groups or what, but you know, there's things to consider like that. And also use of devices, right? I don't know, I've deposed to government since I left the city. I've deposed to council, and I have a friend say, gee, you were working for government, now you're deposing the government? And well, yes, I am. And it's a very different experience. And unfortunately, a lot of the councillors and so on are on their devices and they're not really listening. And that also sends a message, doesn't it? So I think, again, back to the nuances of all this kind of thing, right? There is, it seems to me there's a standard way of engaging with your government, and that's maybe not the best way. So I think back to agency, as citizens, we need to, and in fact, if I depose again, I'm going to actually say something. If someone takes out their phone and stop and just say, perhaps the chair would want to indicate that put your phones away because taking time off work and whatever. I don't want to preach, but anyway, those are all issues. And I think we do have to recognize them and then somehow address them. And I don't think you have to be mean about it, but you could be. I mean, now that I'm an older guy, I can be crotchety, right? But even that, though, is a statement, right? That's, you know, my God, right? So I do think there's nuances, but I think, you know, the idea of the goal is worthy, but we have to keep at it, don't we? And we have to address it, and we have to recognize it, and we have to do something about it to you know, drop back into some older habits. Isn't good. I have one more a comment I want to make. It's an anecdote. I was driving up near a mall on Ellesmere, and there was a light, and a driver, again, demographically, he was a white guy. I don't know if that's important or not, but he yelled at the lady crossing, who was moving quite slow, had a bit of a limp, and he said, "Jesus Christ, you gimp, move it." And I wasn't sure what to do in a situation like that. You know, should I weigh in, or should the person that had the situation at weigh in? I mean, what would be your take on that kind of overt statement made? I mean, you know, where do we fit in that kind of addressing it right on the spot? Is it a teachable moment, or do you just let it go by? That's a tough question, I know.
Yeah, and I don't think there are easy answers. So if you're looking for an easy answer, I mean, you need to take into account just there have been complete disasters that arise from that. But I do think we all need to know, we do all need to take responsibility. I mean, we are all implicit or complicit in the way that our systems are designed at the moment. So perhaps that might not be the time, given the situation at the intersection and what might emerge. But I think we should all start to think about what is our responsibility here? What are we accepting? What are we exonerating? And join the conversation and start to see what particular role can I play in helping to change this.
I think too, the risks. Oh, sorry, the risk.
I know we're running out of time, but I just want to also jump in and just, you know, when we think of situations like that and how to respond, we often think about the person who, you know, who did the offending, right? But we don't think about the person to whom it was directed. And there we could, you know, I think have a big impact by just approaching that person and, you know, and making sure they're okay. And that goes a long way, because that person may have had, you know, a number of such incidents, you know, in recent days or weeks or whatnot, and just reassuring them and making them feel seen and heard in a kind way goes much further than trying to change somebody else's behavior and attitude. And we forget about that person in those situations sometimes. But that's really an opportunity.
And since there's policy people listening, think about cumulative harms, those million cuts from low impact, medium impact decisions that are made against you. And that's something that we're completely ignoring in ADA or in the Directive on Automated Decision Making or on any of the policy documents that are coming out in Canada. Think about, as Mai says, those individuals that are experiencing this on a day-to-day basis.
I have a great thing I've used in presentations. It's called ILAC. Just what you were talking about, right? It's have that written out on a paper, and each time you get a cut, you can really destroy that. And ILAC is for I am lovable and capable. We need to summarize, actually. We've run out of time. It's been a great session, and it sure went fast. And again, like I said in the first panel, we're going to have to do more of this to be sure. But I'd like each of you just to give a quick summary in regards to what we've talked about and maybe the takeaway you'd like to see from here for our audience listening. And we'll start with Maya, I think.
Thanks for starting with me as I formulate my thoughts. I have so many takeaways from this great conversation. But I think, for the audience here, I don't know, I think most of us are in public sector or organizations, government, just to think about, all the opportunities for us to really lead, in this sector and think about our data processes from beginning to end. Even from point of inception, when we're developing policy tools or technical tools to serve our populations, and really build equity in it, and think about how we engage in an inclusive way, not in the standard ways that we have done. So thinking outside the box, and I think there is hope, but I think there's a lot of cause for us to pause and reflect on where we're going.
Fabulous. Jutta.
Yeah, I'll echo much of what Maya said. I think that the gift of AI is that it is throwing a mirror on what we're doing. We're choosing a power tool to do things more effectively, efficiently, accurately, at a lower cost. But what in fact, where are we headed with this? Do we actually want to continue on this course? Once we hand it over and exonerate ourselves of responsibility, once we hand it over to these machines, we are in fact sort of pointing them in a single direction. And we know that direction is not, it's leading to disparity, it's leading to the destruction of our environment, etc. So AI is a mirror that we should use to question what we're doing and how we're doing it and who it's affecting and how we are, what sort of society we're creating at the moment.
And to Blair.
Just echoing Jutta and Mai, my takeaway is just don't stop thinking about with just data and AI, right? Think about organizational context, think about material and social reality, think about the rest of the digital stack that AI is being built on top of, the existing data infrastructure, digital systems, take a systems perspective, take a value chains perspective, think upstream and downstream, where are your workers coming from? Who are your workers? How are they being educated? Where are they being educated? And in addition, upstream, think downstream. What is the data that we're working with here? What is the AI we're building here going to be used to do out in the real world? And how might that reinforce injustice or inequity?
Awesome stuff, panel. I have to thank you for your involvement. We appreciate it so very much and appreciate you as well. And again, hopefully we'll continue this in a different format. We can have even more questions from the audience. I'm just going to let you know we're going to take a break for 15 minutes. We'll be back at 11:30 actually for the Growing Open panel. And again, separate link for that. So make sure you log in anew. And thank you once again, panel. Really appreciate it. And Nathan, you can now cut the meeting and we'll see everybody back at 11:30. Bye for now.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.